The main activity that you'll use in a state machine. Let's review the difference between sequential workflows and state machine workflows. A sequential workflow executes all of its activities one at a time, starting from the top, going to the bottom, until they're all executed or the workflow is interrupted. A state machine workflow starts in a particular state and then moves to additional states in response to external events. That event could be that a file appeared in a directory, or typically it will be because a user took some action like clicking a button on a form. Good examples of state machine workflows are expense reports, loan applications, order processing, anything where the workflow starts in a particular state and then you wait for something to happen. The main activity that you'll use in a state machine workflow that distinguishes it from a sequential, of course, is the state activity. And that state activity represents the state the workflow's in. The state activity doesn't execute actions itself. It contains activities that execute. And when you create a state machine workflow, you're going to designate one state as the initial state and one state as the completed state. When the workflow begins, it's in its initial state, and then when it reaches the completed state, the workflow ends. You'll use the setState activity to transition the workflow from one state to another. And the target state property of that activity identifies the state that you want the workflow to go into next. And typically, you'll use the setState activity inside an event-driven activity, and that's what's going to cause the workflow to change states based on something happening. So let's talk a little bit more about the event-driven activity. Most state changes are going to happen because of an external event. The manager approved or rejected the expense report. Somebody records that the item is now in stock, so the workflow can move to the shipping state. And the way you handle external events in a state machine workflow is by using the event-driven activity. The event-driven activity is a sequence activity, so it can contain other activities. The first activity in it has to implement iEvent activity. And that could be a delay activity, a handle external event activity, or a receive activity. And then the last activity in there is typically going to be a setState activity. So an event will occur, and you'll handle that with, say, a handle external event or a receive. Then what activities do you want to happen at that point, followed by what state do you want the workflow to go to next. Now before we go take a look at state machine workflows, we need to talk a little bit about persistence. A workflow in memory consumes resources. There's processing power, there's memory, there's the state of variables. What happens if the host reboots and the workflow restarts? You have to shut down the server, install some updates or install some new software, and then start up the server again. Now the workflow restarts. What happens to the state of the workflow? Well, unless you do something to save that state, all information is lost. Workflow Foundation has a pluggable persistent service mechanism which makes it really easy to save state. So you'll add persistence to a workflow, and you can do this in code or in a configuration file. Now you can save data in a database. You can actually save persistence information to XML files, but the easiest thing to do is to use SQL Server. And that's because Workflow ships with the SQL Workflow Persistence class, which will automatically save state to a SQL Server database, and then, when necessary, go and retrieve that state. And to use SQL Persistence, you have to do three things. You have to create a persistence database. You can call it anything you want. And then you run two scripts. There's a script that creates the necessary schema. This ships with Workflow Foundation. And then there's a script that actually configures the persistence. So you create the database, go find these two scripts, run them, and now you can easily store state in the SQL Server database. So let's say you have a state machine workflow that models the expense report submission process. You submit your expense report, the workflow moves to the waiting for resolution state. Hours go by, weeks go by, before your manager takes a look at your expense report. The state of that workflow will be persisted, and that actual workflow instance can shut down. There's no need for that workflow to stay in memory for 2 weeks before your manager looks at your expense report. So the state will be written to the SQL database, the workflow will shut down. Now the manager starts his or her application, looks at your expense report and clicks approve. Now the workflow will fire up. The workflow runtime will go into the SQL Server database, retrieve the state for that specific instance, and then run the workflow. So let's go see how to make a state machine workflow service. I have the state machine workflow service demo solution open. Right now it has a Windows project with a form, and it has a website which will host the service we're about to create. So let me open the form. I'm going to use this to manage expense reports. I'll enter an activity and an amount, and then I'll click Submit, and that's going to fire off a state machine workflow. The workflow will then wait for me to either approve or reject the expense report. So let's add the workflow. I'm going to right-click on the solution and add a new project. And in the WCF project types, I'm going to create a state machine workflow service library. And I'm going to call this WF expense report. And I'm going to call this WF expense reports service library. When I click OK, Visual Studio creates the project and creates the workflow. And this is a state machine workflow. In a previous section, we created a sequential workflow. Here we're using a state machine. Notice that there are two states. There's an initial state, workflow 1 initial state. And you can tell this is the initial state because the icon has a green circle in it. The second state, called state activity 1, is the completed state, and this has a red circle in it. And then there's an event-driven activity inside this initial state. If we double-click on that, Visual Studio adds a receive activity and a set state activity. Now this receive activity is using getData, which is the method in the boilerplate interface. And then the set state activity says move to the state activity 1, which is the completed activity. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is rename this interface. I don't want it to be called iWorkflow1. I want it to be called iExpenseReport. And I also want to rename the workflow from workflow1 to expense report workflow. Now let's define the service contract. So I'll go into iExpenseReport. And I'm going to delete this getData, and I'm going to add my own operations. I have a snippet for that, 7B01. I've got 3 methods. Submit expense report, which takes an activity and an amount and returns a GUID. Then approve report and reject report, which take GUIDs. And that GUID is going to be the report ID. So each expense report will be uniquely identified by an ID. Okay, now let's go back to the workflow. I don't like the default names of things, so I'm going to change the name of this state to report submitted. Notice that I immediately get an error because now the workflow doesn't have an initial state. So if you rename a state that's the initial state, it doesn't retain that property. So there's 2 ways I can fix this. I can right-click on the state and set as initial state, or I can select the workflow and set the initial state name property of the workflow to that state. Then I'm going to rename event-driven activity 1 to handle submission. And I'm going to rename state activity 1 to completed. And then mark this as the completed state. Okay, then I want to add an intermediate state to this workflow. So in the toolbox, I'll drag a state activity onto the designer, and I'm going to name this waiting for resolution. Okay, so now I need to define how the workflow moves from report submitted to waiting for resolution and then on to completed, and what it does in response to events. So let's view the code for the workflow, and let's get rid of these variables, which were used in the getData method that I got rid of. I'm going to add my own declarations. I've got a field for activity, which is a string, one for amount, which is a double, and one for report ID, which is a GUID. Okay, now let's go back to the designer. Let's actually close down the interface because we're done with that. Save a little screen real estate here. Now let's double-click Handle Submission. Visual Studio added this receive activity and wired it up to getData. I now need to identify which operation this is associated with. I use the service operation info property for that. When I click the ellipsis, I added submit expense report, approve report, and reject report. I'm going to use submit expense report. Then I'm going to bind the activity property to this activity field I created. I'm going to bind amount to the amount field, and I'm going to set the return value to the report ID. And then canCreateInstance is set to true, so when the client calls the submit expense report method, that will create a new instance of the workflow. And after that, I want the workflow to transition to the waiting for resolution state. Now let's go back to the workflow designer. I can either use the breadcrumb and click expense report workflow, or I can select workflow back to state composition view. I want to add a couple additional event handlers, one for the expense report being approved, one for it being rejected. So from the toolbox, I'll drag an event-driven activity into waiting for resolution, and I'll call this handle approval, and then I'll add another one and call that handle rejection. Now I'll double-click handle approval, and I'm going to add to this a receive activity. And that receive activity is going to be associated with our interface, and it's going to be associated with the approve report method. So again, I will bind report ID to the report ID, and there is no return value, so just report ID. Notice that canCreateInstance is set to false. When the client calls approve report, we're not going to create a brand new instance of the workflow. We're going to continue using this instance. And then I'll do, let's go back here for a second. After this event occurs, I want to transition the workflow to the completed state. The expense report's been approved, and the workflow is done. And then I'm going to do something very similar with handle rejection. I'm going to add a receive activity, and associate that with the reject report method. Bind the report ID, canCreateInstance, again set to false, and then use the set state activity to move the workflow to the completed state, and the workflow ends. So now here's my state machine workflow. When the client calls submit expense report, the workflow starts, moves into the waiting for resolution stage, and then if the expense report is approved or rejected, then the workflow is done. Okay, let's save this. Let's build it. All right, so far so good. Now I want to define what happens when an expense report is submitted or approved or rejected. So I'm going to go into code here, and I need a couple of using statements. I need system.io and system.text. Then I'm going to need a couple additional declarations. I need a string writer, and I need a string which will contain the name of a file. Then I'm going to go back into the designer, go into handle submission, and say that when the expense report is submitted, I'm going to run a code activity, and I'm going to name that code activity log submission. So here's what I want in this. I want to record the expense report. I could have used a database, but I didn't really feel like creating a new database for this, so I'm just going to write it to a text file. So if necessary, I'll create the directory /appdev, create a new instance of the string writer, and then write that the expense report was submitted. The expense report is going to have a GUID associated with it, and I'm going to use the instance ID of the workflow, which is a GUID. That tells me not only the expense report, but also which workflow instance is running. Then I'm going to write the activity and the amount, and then save this to a text file with the same name as the GUID. Okay, we'll go back to the workflow now. What happens if an expense report is approved? I'm going to add another code activity, and I will call it log approval. And I'm going to write to that text file that the expense report was approved. And first, though, I need a couple of methods. One called write to file, one called rename file. And then, when the expense report is approved, I'm going to write to file, passing the instance ID and approved, and then rename the file. So when this gets approved, I'm going to write that the expense report, whatever was approved, and I'm going to write that to the file. And because the expense report's been resolved, I'm going to rename the file. That way, just by looking at the file names, I can distinguish between expense reports that haven't been resolved and those that have. And then finally, I want to do something similar for the report being rejected. So into reject report, I will drag a code activity, and I will call this log rejection. And the code that I want to execute, 7B08, writes rejected and then renames the file. Now this workflow could be long running. So I submit an expense report and then I wait. Could be hours, days, weeks, could be a while before my manager approves my expenses. So what I want to do is set up persistence for this workflow so that the workflow can be taken out of memory, state written to a SQL Server database, and then when the manager approves or rejects the expense report, then the workflow will start back up, the workflow runtime will read the state out of the database, and then it can continue on. So I'm going to set that up in the configuration file, in the web.config file, because this workflow is being hosted by IIS. So if we look at expense report service.svc, here's the service, expense report service library.expense report workflow, and we're using the workflow service host. And then in the web.config, let's scroll down to the system.service model section. Here's the name of the service, and here's the contract. And then what I want to do I actually want to include exception detail in false, so if anything happens, we get a clue as to what's going on. And what I want to do right in here is set up persistence. Now I have a snippet for that, but it's a C# snippet, and I did that to keep it in the same place as all the other snippets. But I can't add a C# snippet into an XML file, which is this config file. So what I'm going to do is come back into here, into my C# file, and add my snippet, which is XML, but it's marked as C#. That's why Visual Studio wouldn't have added it to app.config. So I'll cut that out of here and paste it in right here. So I have a workflow runtime element. The name is workflow service host runtime. And then in the services, I'm going to add a type system.workflow.runtime.hosting.sql workflow persistence service. And I'm going to point it to the SQL persistence database, which I created in SQL Server. And then in the web host, I need to add a reference to the actual workflow service, which we just created. So I'll add a reference to WF expense report service library. And that way, when we call this, the web host can actually find it. Okay, save this, rebuild it. And let's right-click on expense report service.svc and view in browser. Get an error. The service behavior requires that the binding associated with the endpoint supports the context protocol because the contract may require a session. This is a state machine workflow, and therefore we need to maintain state. That means a session. And the binding we're using, WSHTTP binding, doesn't support the context protocol, which is necessary. So what we need to do is use a different binding. So in the web.config, I'm going to change this from WSHTTP binding to WSHTTP context binding. And that will enable me to use sessions with this workflow service. There's a basic HTTP context binding. There's also a net TCP context binding. So now I'll save this, rebuild, and right-click on the SVC and view in browser. And now it works. Okay, so now we are ready to call the workflow service from the client. So in the client application, I'm going to add a service reference. I can click Discover, and here's web host expense report service. And here are the three operations, and I'm going to call this expense report service. Click OK. Visual Studio adds the proxy class, which is expense report service. Okay, so now let's go into the form, and let's add a using for that. Windows client.expense report service. Let's add a couple of declarations, which is snippet 7b10. We have our proxy, and we have a GUID, which is going to be the report ID. So now I need to create a new instance of the proxy class. Ordinarily, I would put that code in the load, but here I'm not going to. I'm going to put that code in the submit. And I'll tell you why in a second. So SB11, that's that code, and then the code to create the proxy, which apparently I don't have a snippet for. Proxy equals new expense report client, and then I need to specify the name of the endpoint, which is in the app.config, and that is this. So I'll copy this and put it here. Ooh, I will put it here. Have I done this right yet? Okay. Control A, K, F. Line everything up. I guess it didn't line everything up. All right, there we go. Okay, so when I submit an expense report, I create a new instance of the proxy class and then call the submit expense report method, passing the activity and the amount and displaying that the expense report was submitted. So after we run this, I'll show you what happens if I put the proxy in the load. Okay, so if I approve an expense report, I'm going to run this code. I'll call the approve report method and pass the report ID. And if I reject one, then I'll call, I don't have a snippet for this. Okay. Well, that code looks like this, only instead of calling approve report, I will call reject report. Okay, let's build this, and let's run this. So I'll enter an activity, lunch with team, amount 25, and when I click submit, that will call the submit expense report method on that service, which starts the workflow. The workflow will log the submission and write a file into this folder here, and then transition to the waiting for resolution state. So I'll click submit. The report was submitted. Here's the text file with the unique ID, and here's the expense report submitted. Now, if I click approve, that will call the approve report method. The state machine right now is in the waiting for resolution state. When I click approve, the workflow will log the approval, move to the completed state, and the workflow will end. And the approve renames the file to resolved so that I can see that this expense report was resolved. Now, let me enter another one. Dinner with team. I'll submit this. And here's our second expense report, and I can reject this. And it has been rejected. Okay. Now, when I first wrote this, I did this a little bit differently. I'm just very used to creating the new instance of the proxy class when the form loads in the previous sections. That's the pattern that we used. Let's see what happens if we do that. Let's run this. So, dinner with the team, $100. I submit this. And let's prove this. So here is dinner with team for $100 approved. So now let's do another one. Weekend getaway with team. And I'm going to submit that. And this blows up. Workflow with ID, blah, 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 not found in state persistence store. So here's what happens. I created the proxy class when the form loaded and then called submit expense report. And submit expense report here in the workflow is associated with this receive activity, which has create instance set to true. So when I call submit expense report, a new instance of the workflow will be created. But when I create the proxy first and then reuse it over and over again, the second time I call this, the proxy class still thinks it's working with the initial instance of the workflow. Whereas the submit expense report has actually caused a new instance of the workflow to be created. And so basically that error message says the proxy class thinks it's on one instance of the workflow, but the workflow thinks it's on a different instance. So the solution is to create a new instance of the proxy class each time I submit, and that starts the workflow. So in this demo, you've seen creating a state machine workflow service. It's a long-running or durable service, so we added persistence. And then each time we call a method of the service, that raises an event which the state machine workflow responds to and then transitions to the next state. (7B08) writes rejected and then renamed